The human walked slowly into the camp, her steps quiet but steady. Around her, the air was heavy with tension, filled with the sound of laughter and whispers from the alien crowd that had gathered to watch. They had seen many cruel games before, but this one was different. This time, it was not just a test, it was meant to be a trap. At the edge of the open space stood cages, each one holding predator cubs, young, fierce creatures with teeth sharp enough to tear through flesh and eyes that burned with hunger. The aliens believed these cubs were their strongest tools of fear, wild things that no one could tame. The plan was simple: throw a human inside, release the cubs, and let nature decide. To them, there was no question about the ending. A human would never survive. The moment she entered the center of the camp, the whispers grew louder. Some laughed cruelly, others shouted that the show would not last long. Their voices carried an edge of excitement, as though they were waiting for a festival of blood. The cages rattled as the cubs paced behind the bars, their growls rumbling low in their throats. Their claws scratched against the ground, restless and eager. Everyone leaned forward, eager to see the human's fear, to watch her tremble, to witness the moment she would run and be dragged down. But the expected fear never came. Instead, the human looked around slowly, her eyes calm, her body quiet. There was no screaming, no frantic glances, no trembling hands. She simply stood there, taking in the space, the crowd, and the hungry cubs. Her stillness unsettled the onlookers. They shifted, frowning, whispering again. Why wasn't she afraid? Why wasn't she panicking? Fear was what they wanted to see, and fear was what she refused to give. Then came the moment the aliens had been waiting for. With a loud clang, the cages opened, and the cubs bounded out into the open. They circled, muscles taut, shoulders rolling as they moved closer, their teeth flashing in the dim light. The crowd shouted in excitement, ready for the first strike, but the human did something none of them expected. Instead of running or raising her arms to defend herself, she lowered a small bundle she had been carrying. Piece by piece, she set it down carefully on the ground. A cloth spread across the dirt, a few items placed neatly upon it. Dried bread, pieces of fruit, and small strips of meat she had carried with her. And then, with a calmness that silenced even the noisiest alien, she set a wooden surface in the middle, like a small table, creating a place not for fighting, but for sharing. The crowd roared with laughter. To them, it was foolishness beyond measure. What good was a table against teeth and claws? What good was bread against hunger that demanded flesh? They mocked her openly, pointing, jeering, their voices echoing through the camp. But the human did not react. She moved with slow, careful hands, arranging the food as if she had all the time in the world, as if the snapping growls circling her meant nothing at all. She even brushed crumbs from the cloth gently, like a host preparing for guests. The cubs were confused. They had been released into chaos before, and their instincts told them what usually followed. Screaming, running, the thrill of the chase. But this time, there was no chase. There was no fear. Instead, there was food. The smell of dried meat carried through the air, faint, but enough to reach their sharp noses. They circled closer, their growls softening, not out of trust, but out of curiosity. Hunger fought with instinct, and for a moment they hesitated. The aliens leaned forward, waiting for the cubs to spring. Some shouted for them to attack, waving their arms as if they could force the outcome they wanted. But still the human remained calm, her hands resting in her lap, her breathing slow and steady. She did not flinch when the nearest cub lowered, its head to sniff the ground near her. She did not pull the food back, did not try to hide it, did not even look afraid when sharp teeth hovered close. Her calmness was stronger than chains. For a long moment, the camp grew quiet. The crowd that had come for blood now leaned forward in silence, caught between disbelief and anger. Was this truly happening? Was she really sitting there, unarmed, preparing food as though the cubs were guests instead of predators? It was more than strange. It was offensive to them. They wanted fear, but what they saw was dignity. They wanted screams, but what they heard was only the quiet rustle of cloth and the soft sound of food being placed down. The cubs circled tighter, their tails twitching, their eyes fixed on the food. They did not leap, not yet, but neither did they retreat. They were waiting, uncertain. And in that uncertainty, something unexpected was born. A pause. A pause long enough for the human's gesture to settle in their minds. She was not prey. She was not running. She was simply inviting. The aliens did not understand. To them, kindness was weakness. Sharing food was foolishness. But the human understood something different. She knew hunger spoke louder than cruelty, that trust could be built in the quiet moments when no one expected it. So she sat there, steady and patient, as if she believed the cubs would make a choice that no one else could imagine. And as the crowd shifted and muttered, growing restless with the lack of blood, the trap they had built began to unravel. Because what they thought would be a scene of death was slowly becoming something else, something far more dangerous to their power. It was becoming a story. She had walked into their camp as a victim, but in the stillness of that moment, with nothing more than a cloth, a small table, and food shared without fear, she had already begun to change the outcome. The cubs had not attacked. The human had not broken. And though the night was far from over, one truth had already taken root in the minds of those watching. Perhaps strength was not always teeth and claws, but courage, calm, and the simple act of kindness shown even when surrounded by danger. The trap had been set. But the first move belonged not to the predators, not to the crowd, but to the human who refused to play by their rules. And as she sat there, waiting with quiet patience, the camp began to sense that the ending they had expected might never come. The cubs moved in slow, deliberate circles around her, their low growls vibrating through the ground like distant thunder. Each step they took pressed sharp claws into the dirt, leaving small marks that reminded everyone watching of the danger she faced. Their eyes gleamed, catching the faint light of the campfires, their gaze fixed on her as though weighing whether she was prey or something else. The aliens in the crowd leaned forward with wide grins, whispering to one another, already certain they knew what would happen next. To them, this was entertainment. They expected the cubs to strike at any moment, to lunge with snapping jaws and teeth meant for tearing. And yet, in the center of it all, the human sat quietly, steady and calm, as if the storm circling her had no power. Instead of scrambling to her feet or raising her arms in defense, she reached into the small bundle she had carried in with her. Every movement was deliberate, unhurried, as though time itself had slowed. One by one, she placed items on the cloth before her. A piece of bread, torn gently in half, a strip of dried fruit, its sweet smell faint but distinct, and a few small pieces of meat, the kind she had saved for this moment. It was not much, nothing compared to the hunger of sharp-toothed predators, but it was all she had. She laid it down not as bait, not as a shield, but as an offering, a gesture that said she was not there to fight, not there to run, but to share. The crowd erupted with laughter, pointing at her as if she had lost her mind. They mocked her with cruel words, calling her weak, foolish, and soft. To them, offering food to predators was the same as handing them her life. The noise of their jeers filled the air, a harsh contrast to the quiet scene in the circle where the human remained seated. But their laughter could not reach her. She neither flinched nor looked away. Her attention was on the cubs. Her hand, still resting near the small pile of food, palm open, showing no fear. The cubs hesitated. Their growls wavered into silence as the scent of the food reached them. Hunger stirred in their bellies, fighting with the instinct that told them to attack. One stepped a little closer, nose twitching, eyes narrowing in confusion. This was not how their releases usually went. They were used to chaos, to prey that ran and screamed, to the thrill of the hunt. But here was something else, something different. There was no panic in the air, no frantic movement that set their instincts ablaze. Instead, there was stillness, patience, and the faint, irresistible smell of meat. The nearest cub lowered its head, sniffing the air with sharp breaths. Its shoulders rippled with tension, ready to spring if danger appeared, but still it did not leap. The food on the ground drew its focus, stronger now than the strange quietness of the human. The other cubs, watching closely, mirrored its hesitation. Their circle slowed, their eyes flicking between her steady form and the food she had placed as if trying to solve a puzzle they had never faced before. The crowd, impatient and angry at the delay, shouted louder. Some stomped their feet, demanding the cubs act, demanding the blood they were promised. Their voices were filled with frustration, but the cubs did not respond to them. They kept their attention fixed on the human, caught between curiosity and hunger. It was as though the calm heartbeat in her chest carried more weight than the noise outside the circle. She did not speak, nor did she force them closer. Her hand remained open, a simple sign of trust. Every part of her posture told the cubs that she was not a threat. She was not prey either. She was something else entirely, someone willing to share. Her breathing was slow, steady, and the cubs began to match it without realizing, their restless pacing softening into measured steps. Finally, the smallest cub, driven by hunger stronger than doubt, edged forward. Its paws pressed lightly into the ground, its nose dipping lower until it brushed against the bread she had placed. The crowd fell silent in disbelief, their jeers cut short as the cub sniffed, hesitated, then took the piece in its mouth. It stepped back, chewing carefully, its eyes never leaving the human. The others followed the movement, their growls replaced by quiet snorts as they too leaned closer, drawn in by the food she had laid down. The aliens watching could not understand what they were seeing. To them, this was impossible. Predator. Cubs did not pause, did not wait, did not choose food over the easy kill before them. Yet here they were, hesitating in the shadow of a human stillness, pulled not by violence but by a gesture of peace. The human, for her part, did not smile. In victory or move in triumph, she simply remained calm, her hand resting gently near the cloth, offering what she had without expectation. It was not a command, not a demand, only an invitation, and somehow that quiet invitation carried more strength than all the chains and cages the aliens had ever used to control the cubs. One by one, the young predators lowered their heads, sniffing, choosing pieces of food, circling closer to her instead of lunging at her. Their sharp teeth brushed near her fingers, but she did not flinch. Her calmness taught them to trust, even if only for a moment. And in that moment, the trap that had been set began to crumble. The crowd was restless now, their excitement fading into confusion. They had come to see blood, to watch a human fail, but what they were witnessing was something entirely different. A bond beginning to form where no bond should have been possible. Whispers spread quickly through the onlookers, doubt creeping into their voices. Could it be that the beasts they had raised in fear could choose something other than violence? Could it be that a human could stand among them without being torn apart? As the cubs ate in silence, the human's presence shifted the air. What had begun as a cruel game had turned into something unexpected, a lesson. She had shown that even The sharpest teeth could pause before kindness, that even predators could hesitate when offered trust instead of terror. The aliens did not yet know it, but this was the first step of something larger. The first offering, simple and quiet, was not just food laid upon the ground. It was the seed of change, planted in the hearts of beasts and in the doubts of those who watched. And though the night was not yet over, the story had already begun to grow. One cub moved first, its paws brushing lightly against the dirt as though every step carried a weight of decision. Its ears twitched, its nose stretched toward the food, and the sound of its quiet breaths seemed louder than the crowd's murmurs. The other cubs paused, watching, their eyes sharp with suspicion yet drawn by hunger. The little predator leaned down, sniffing at the bread, the meat, the fruit laid before it, as if testing whether this was a trap or a gift. Then, with one swift motion, it took a piece in its mouth. The moment stretched long, the watchers holding, their breath, waiting for the bite to be followed by a strike at the human. But no strike came. The cub stepped back, chewing, its gaze fixed on her, not in anger, not in fear, but in something new. Curiosity. The camp fell into silence. The aliens, who had filled the air with mocking laughter before, now found themselves stunned into quiet. What they had believed impossible was unfolding before their eyes. One cub had broken the pattern of violence, and as though that single choice had opened a hidden door, the others began to move. A second cub padded closer, its growl lower now, uncertain but less hostile. It sniffed the food, glancing between the human's steady hand and the scraps on the cloth. A twitch of its nose, a hesitation, and then it, too, lowered its head and picked up a piece. The third followed, its steps more confident, as though emboldened by the other's trust. Soon, the circle of tension began to dissolve into a gathering of quiet bodies, noses dipping and teeth carefully taking from the pile of food she had laid out. The human did not move suddenly or push herself into their space. She sat still, her posture gentle, her breathing steady. Every gesture she made was slow, as if the rhythm of her heart was guiding her hands. She reached for the food she had saved, laying down more pieces bit by bit. Bread softened by her touch. Fruit cut small so their sharp teeth could handle it easily, meat offered in pieces that showed thought, not desperation. She gave not with force, but with patience, each offering laid out like a promise. The cubs began to settle around her, no longer circling with bared teeth, but lowering themselves onto the ground, their tails flicking softly against the dirt. They ate, but not with the frenzy of predators fighting for scraps. Instead, they ate with a strange quiet, almost orderly, their eyes flicking up at her between bites. It was as though they were trying to understand why she had done this, why she had chosen not to fight them, not to scream, but to share what little she had. The crowd, confused and restless, whispered among themselves. This was not the spectacle they had come for. Where they expected chaos, they were met with calm. Where they expected death, they were witnessing a meal. The human, for her part, did not think of it as victory. She did not grin or laugh in defiance of the guards. Instead, she treated it as something natural, as though sharing a meal was the most ordinary thing in the world. Her eyes softened as she watched the cubs eat, and every now and then she let her hand rest lightly near the food, close enough that the braver ones could brush against her skin as they took their share. Each time one of them did, she did not flinch. She let them feel her calmness, her lack of fear, and slowly that calmness began to settle into them as well. The night deepened, and the firelight flickered against the walls of the camp. Shadows danced across the faces of the aliens who shifted uneasily in their seats. This was not the lesson they had hoped to teach. They wanted to show the weakness of a human, to watch her fail before the strength of creatures bred for violence. Yet here she was, not only surviving but doing something far more powerful. She was changing the meaning of the cubs' hunger. She was giving them a choice they had never been given, to eat without blood, to sit without fear, to rest beside someone they were meant to destroy. One cub, bolder than the rest, moved closer than the others dared. It stepped within arm's reach, its fur brushing the edge of her knee as it bent to take another piece of bread from the cloth. The human's hand lowered slowly, fingers hovering above its head. She did not force the touch, but left the choice to the cub. For a moment, it froze, its golden eyes meeting hers. Then, to the disbelief of every onlooker, the cub lowered its head slightly, allowing her hand to graze its fur. The contact was brief, but it was enough. The bond had shifted, fragile yet undeniable. The other cubs, noticing, drew closer too. They no longer saw her as prey, but as part of their circle. Some lay down after eating, curling their bodies against one another, their tails resting on the ground with the ease of creatures unthreatened. Others kept near her, watching her with eyes that seemed to search for meaning in her silence. What had been designed as a moment of terror was instead turning into a feast, not of hunger alone, but of trust. The camp remained eerily quiet, the only sounds the crunch of teeth against food, the soft breathing of predators who should have been snarling, and the gentle hum of a human's steady presence. For the first time, the cubs seemed less like weapons, and more like what they truly were, young, uncertain creatures who wanted warmth as much as they wanted strength. And for the first time, the aliens began to question whether their old truths still held. As the meal ended, the human gathered what little remained and placed it gently before them. She made no move to reclaim anything for herself. Instead, she leaned back slightly, her hands resting in her lap, her eyes calm and accepting. The cubs, satisfied, lingered near her rather than retreating. They did not leap or growl. They did not scatter in hunger's madness. They simply stayed, drawn by something beyond food, a presence they did not want to leave. The onlookers, once eager for entertainment, now sat restless and unsettled. They had not witnessed a fight, but they had witnessed something stranger, perhaps even more dangerous to their ways, a bond forming in a place meant for fear. And though the night was not yet over, it was clear to all that something had shifted, forever. The trap, once designed for death, had turned into a meal of peace. And that simple act, bread shared, fruit divided, meat offered without fear, would not be forgotten, not by the cubs, and not by those who watched with wide, silent eyes. The days stretched on, and what began as a single act of quiet courage slowly grew into something larger than anyone watching could understand. Each morning, as the cold light broke across the alien camp, the girl sat with the predator cubs just as she had on the first day. She did not run, she did not fight, and she did not show them fear. Instead, she continued her gentle pattern, placing bits of food before them, speaking softly in words they could not fully understand but could feel in the rhythm of her tone. Her voice carried no threat, only calmness, as though she was weaving a lullaby into the air around them. The cubs, creatures who once knew only snarls and hunger, began to lean toward that calm as though it was a kind of warmth they had never been offered before. At first, their movements were cautious, full of hesitation. They circled her as they had in the beginning, but less often now with bared teeth and more often with quiet curiosity. Their sharp eyes studied her every motion, testing her, waiting for the sudden flash of fear or aggression they had been taught to expect. Yet none came. The girl's hands moved with patience, her breathing steady, her gaze soft. Over time, the cubs stopped waiting for violence, because violence never came. What replaced it was something entirely new: trust. As the days blended, Into nights, the bond between them began to show in small, unmistakable signs. When the cold air swept through the camp and the ground grew hard with frost, the cubs no longer slept in scattered corners. Instead, they pressed closer to her, their bodies forming a living shield against the night. She would curl into herself for warmth, only to feel the heat of their fur against her back, their slow breathing settling into the rhythm of her own. The first time it happened, the crowd gasped, certain it was a trick before a strike. But morning came, and the girl rose still alive, the cubs resting peacefully beside her as though she belonged among them. The aliens, hardened and confident in their ways, began to whisper in disbelief. This was not how the beasts behaved. They were bred to be weapons, raised to snarl and tear, not to bow their heads or settle their paws beside a fragile human. The more the girl repeated her simple kindness, the stronger the bond grew, and the harder it became for the onlookers to deny what their own eyes revealed. The cubs, once feared as untamable, were beginning to change, not by force, not by chains, but by the quiet weight of compassion. The change deepened with each passing day. When she spoke softly, the cubs pricked their ears, listening not to her words but to the tone, the calm that wrapped around them like a blanket. When she sat still, they mirrored her stillness, their restless energy fading into quiet waiting. And when she moved to place food before them, they did not lunge or fight, but took turns, their sharp teeth grazing carefully so as not to harm the hand that fed them. Bit by bit, their wild edges softened, not into weakness, but into a new kind of strength, the strength of choosing peace. It was not only during meals that the shift revealed itself. In the evenings, when the guards passed by the enclosure, the cubs would growl and bare their teeth at the sight of chains and weapons. Yet if the girl lifted her hand, their growls would soften into silence, their eyes turning to her as though waiting for her signal. She had no chains, no commands, no whips or tools of control. Yet her quiet presence carried more weight than all the weapons the aliens had ever wielded. Without realizing it, she had become their center, their anchor. Soon, the cubs began to follow her movements not out of hunger but out of loyalty. When she walked the edges of the enclosure, they padded after her, their paws pressing softly into the dirt, their eyes alert. When she sat to rest, they circled around her, forming a living barrier between her and the world. The aliens could no longer deny the truth. What they had once called beasts had chosen her as their own. She was no longer prey, no longer an outsider. To the cubs, she had become something far greater, a member of their pack. The disbelief of the watchers turned into unease. The guards whispered that it was dangerous, that the beasts had only learned a new trick, that sooner or later the girl would slip and blood would finally spill. Yet the longer they waited, the harder it was to cling to that expectation. Each day that passed without violence was another crack in their old beliefs. Each night the cubs rested at her side was another reminder that what they thought impossible was happening before their eyes. The girl, unaware of the storm her actions were stirring in the hearts of her captors, continued with the same simplicity that had guided her from the beginning. She never raised her hand in violence. She never forced the cubs to obey. She gave what little she had and asked for nothing in return. Her patience was steady, her compassion unwavering, and in that quiet, strength, the cubs found a leader unlike any they had ever known. The camp itself began to feel different. Where once there had been snarls echoing through the nights, there was now the sound of steady breathing, the warmth of bodies lying in peace. Where once the cubs had been weapons waiting to be unleashed, they now appeared as companions, fierce, yet gentle, their loyalty tied not to chains, but to choice. The aliens could not understand it, but they could not deny it either. A bond had been formed, fragile yet undeniable, reshaping what it meant to live alongside creatures bred for fear. And As the days passed into weeks, a quiet truth settled over the camp. The beasts they once feared were no longer beasts at all, at least not to her. They had chosen her, protected her, and made her part of their circle. It was not dominance that had won them, nor force, nor tricks of control. It was a single human's hand, lifted not in violence but in peace, that had changed everything. What was meant to be a cruel lesson for the girl had become something far greater. The cubs no longer belonged to the aliens in the way they once had. They no longer followed the commands of chains or the threats of whips. They followed her because she had shown them something stronger than fear, and in doing so, she had rewritten the bond between predator and prey, between human and beast, between fear and trust. The aliens watched with narrowed eyes, torn between anger and awe. They had set a trap, but what had emerged from it was not weakness, not chaos, but something entirely unexpected. Companionship, loyalty, and a bond that defied everything they believed about power. The girl sat with the cubs one evening, her hands resting softly in her lap, their fur brushing against her sides as they leaned in close. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, but in that moment, there was peace. Peace that came not from chains or commands, but from trust freely given. And as the firelight flickered across the camp, even the watchers could not look away from the sight. For they knew, though none dared to say it aloud, that the beasts they had once feared were no longer theirs to control. The rulers walked back into the camp with heavy steps, their faces set with pride and certainty, for they believed their cruel plan had worked exactly as they had imagined. In their minds, the human would already be gone, consumed by the very predators they had raised for violence, and the cubs would once again stand as proof of their power. But as they drew near, they slowed their pace, for something felt different in the air. The place was quiet. Too quiet. No screams echoed, no roars filled the air, and no chaos greeted them. Instead, they saw a circle of predator cubs, their sharp teeth hidden behind calm jaws, their bodies resting on the ground, their eyes half-lidded with peace. And in the center of that circle sat the human, unharmed, her hands resting gently in her lap, as though she had been waiting for them all along. The rulers stopped, their confidence shaken, their voices caught in their throats, because what they were seeing should not have been possible. These cubs had been raised with hunger, with commands of fear, with chains and cruel lessons. They had been designed to be wild, restless, and dangerous. Yet here they were, sitting with quiet loyalty, their protective stances directed not toward the rulers who had bred them, but toward the fragile human they had meant to destroy. The crowd, who had gathered to witness the ruler's triumph, gasped in disbelief. They leaned forward, their eyes wide, whispering among themselves. Some rubbed their eyes as if they doubted what they were seeing. For generations, they had been taught that strength was born from cruelty, that loyalty was forced by chains, and that humans were too fragile to ever control the untamable. Yet here, right before their eyes, the truth had been broken and rewritten. The human had done what none of their kind had managed. She had reached the hearts of the cubs without weapons, without punishment, without fear. She had offered only food, patience, and a hand that had never struck them. That was all. And somehow, it had been enough. The rulers exchanged uneasy glances, for their trap had not simply failed. It had backfired. What was meant to be a lesson, in humiliation for the human, had turned into a story that weakened their power. They tried to mask their unease with laughter, but it rang hollow in the quiet air. Some of them barked commands, telling the cubs to rise, to attack, to remember the training they had been given. But the cubs did not move. Their ears twitched at the harsh voices, but they pressed themselves closer to the human, their bodies forming a shield around her. Their loyalty was no longer for the rulers. It was for the one who had shown them kindness. The human, still sitting calmly, did not gloat, did not raise her voice, and did not speak a word of triumph. She simply rested a gentle hand on the nearest cub, her touch light and steady, and the great predator lowered its head in response, a gesture of quiet devotion that made the entire crowd fall silent. In that moment, a shift began, not just in the camp, but in the hearts of those who watched. They realized that force had limits, but compassion had no boundaries. What cruelty had failed to achieve, a single act of kindness had transformed. Word began to spread quickly, moving from one witness to another, and soon beyond the camp, beyond the walls, and into distant lands. They spoke of the human who sat among predators and lived, of the cubs who once snarled but now guarded her, with unwavering loyalty, of how a trap built from cruelty had been undone by a feast of trust. The story traveled like fire across dry grass, and with each telling it grew softer, warmer, more human. People told it around fires at night, whispered it in marketplaces, and carried it into their homes. It was no longer just about survival. It had become a legend, a reminder of the power that lives in kindness. The rulers, though angered, could not silence it. The image of predators lying peacefully around a human was too powerful to erase. Their own guards began to question the chains they held. Their own people began to wonder if fear was truly strength, and even some of the younger rulers themselves began to doubt the lessons they had been taught. For once, cruelty had not inspired obedience. It had crumbled under the weight of compassion, and every time the story was told, it took on a life of its own. For the cubs, life was never the same. They no longer answered to the crack of a whip or the pull of a chain. Instead, they followed the human with steady steps, walking beside her, protecting her, not because they were forced, but because they wanted to. At night, they rested near her, their heavy breathing a steady rhythm of safety, and during the day, they moved with her through the camp like shadows of devotion, and she, in turn, treated them not as beasts or weapons, but as companions, offering them food, gentle words, and a trust that had never once been betrayed. For those who remembered the day of the trap, it became more than a memory. It became a tale they would pass on, a lesson to teach their children, a reminder to carry in difficult times. They would say, "Do you remember the human who sat among the predators? Do you remember how she lifted no weapon and yet the beasts bowed at her hand? Do you remember how fear turned into trust and cruelty into peace?" And each time the story was told, hearts grew a little softer, and people began to believe that perhaps kindness was stronger than they had ever realized. And so, the legend of kindness was born, not of great battles, not of loud victories, but of quiet patience, a shared meal, and a simple hand raised in peace. It was a story that outlived the rulers, outlasted their chains, and traveled across generations. The predators, who were once feared as weapons, became protectors, not because they were forced, but because they had been given something no one had ever thought to offer them: gentle care and trust. And at the center of it all was one human who had shown that sometimes the smallest acts, the simplest choices, could carry the weight to change everything. Thus, what began as a cruel trap ended as a legend not of power or fear, but of the quiet strength found in kindness. And as the cubs lay close to her, their bodies calm and their loyalty unshaken, the camp itself became silent, not with fear, but with awe. From that day forward, whenever people spoke of predators and humans, they no longer told stories of blood and chains. Instead, they remembered the day when one human's kindness turned danger into peace, and in doing so, wrote a new truth for all to see.